My name is Dr. M. Shadi Malaklu, and I have the profound privilege of directing this space and chairing women's gender and sexuality studies. I would like to begin with what I know is not enough, which is an acknowledgement of the fact that we live on indigenous territory culled and cultivated by slave labor, and that a land statement will do nothing to restore sovereignty. But what I will say is that we can and do better as a community to disrupt settler systems of domination. We invite you to join us in doing that decolonial work. I am excited today to welcome abolitionist organizer, writer, and assistant professor of political science at Syracuse University, Dr. Jenn M. Jackson. Dr. Jackson also holds appointments in women's and gender studies, African American studies, and LGBT studies, and is a senior research associate at the Campbell Public Affairs Institute at the Maxwell School at Syracuse University. Like our center's namesake, Dr. Jackson is the consummate public scholar. Their research and organizing on Black politics with a focus on racial threat and trauma, gender and sexuality, political behavior, and social movements are prophetic warnings about how to avoid reproducing, as Audre Lorde writes, quote, old expectations and blueprints of response. Their forthcoming book entitled Black Women Taught Us, due out in 2024, is an intellectual and political history of the Black women who model how to do this work. Today's talk, entitled Rejecting Compulsory Love Toward a Politic of Queer Black Expansiveness, Dr. Jackson will meditate on questions of traditional monogamy and heteronormativity via bell hooks' writings. They argue that Black feminist self and communal love reject traditional compulsory sex and gender roles, seeking instead radical space-making and world-building to nurture fuller Black futures. Today's respondent is the new Bell Hooks Center teacher, scholar, in residence, Dr. Shamel Bell. Dr. Shamel joins us this year from Harvard to make community with our students and to help organize next summer's much-anticipated Bell Hooks Symposium. Dr. Bell describes herself as a homeschooling mother, community organizer, critically engaged pedagogue educator, dancer, choreographer, and documentary filmmaker. She is the visionary behind the street dance activist movement and the global dance meditation for Black liberation. She also consults as a social justice expert in the entertainment industry, including Apple TV, and is a chief social impact strategist for several actors as well as people in the music industry. Her work is activated by the statement, as we dance our lives together, we are lifting frequencies and vibrations that with action will create a shift in the world. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge the hard work of my colleagues, namely our student programmers. Will they raise their hands? Yes, please. And that is Itzy, Adriel, and Joy, who are about somewhere. And I want to also acknowledge my colleague, Dr. D.P. Patrick, in Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies, who is doing the labor of recording this event for us, and of course, my captain, Cap Moses. My administrative colleague, without whom none of what we do is possible. I also want to thank our co-sponsors, the Departments of Peace and Social Justice Studies, African and African American Studies, as well as the Carter G. Woodson Center for Interracial Education. We thank them for their generous co-sponsorship of this event. And lastly, a warm welcome and thank you to all of you for attending this first event of ours. We hope that especially the students in the audience will bring the questions that are inspired by today's event to women's and gender and sexuality studies classes. For example, in the spring, Dr. Bell will be teaching Black Feminist theory, where so many of these themes will reemerge. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Jenn M. Jackson to the Bell Hooks Center at Berea College. And one last note, I know many of you have class beginning at 12:40, so do quietly leave as you need to and invite people to come in who perhaps are just ending their classes.
Thank you so much, Dr. M. Thank you everyone for being here. I'm going to start off with a couple of disclaimers about who I am and how I come to the space. First, again, thank you all. I really mean it when I say thank you. I never intended to be a PhD or a public scholar. And so when people actually come to hear what I have to say, I'm always like, whoa, it's surprising. So a couple of things. One thing that you may have noticed already about me, I've taken my jean jacket on and off about 6 times. I am high anxiety. My hands are shaking. I hold a lot of disabilities in my body. And so for me to feel comfortable up here, there's things I'll need to do. I'll need to drink water. My voice might shake a bit, but I'm okay. Don't do what the woman in the airport did yesterday and walk up to me and try and offer me your water that you've been drinking out of. I have my own. Thank you. Couple things about me. My name is Jenn M. Jackson. I am from Oakland, California, born and raised in Oakland, California, and I'm Oakland through and through. I spent about 15 years in Los Angeles and moved to Chicago to do my PhD in 2014. I finished in 2019 at U Chicago. It's an awful place. And I would not go back under any circumstance to work or to study, although I will say it's probably the best experience I've had intellectually in my life. We can talk about that in a different conversation, post tenure, ideally. I'm now a assistant professor at Syracuse University in political science. Like you all can't see me very well, so I'm gonna move up. My work is really in Black politics. Folks will say, "Are you a REP scholar, race and ethnic politics?" And I say, no. I don't study Asian Americans. I don't study Latino politics or Latinx or Latine politics. I don't know much about white folks' politics, but I do know about Black politics. The work that I do is at the nexus of racial trauma and threat, which, although some of you, I'm sure, are not political scientists, so you are like, yeah, sure, we should study racial trauma. Shockingly enough, political science does not have a discipline-wide focus on racial trauma or understand the stakes of why something like trauma would be a political concept to focus on. So shockingly enough, in 2024, my work on racial trauma is surprising to many political scientists. Again, another talk post-tenure. I also study social movements. I work on gender and sexuality, and I also work on political behavior. So I'm concerned about why folks make the decisions that they do to survive and to exist in the political system that we're in. I'm a little bit non-traditional in this respect, which is why I'm in a place like this as a political science scholar. I really am focused on Black feminism, and my first book that comes out in January is a love letter to Black women. Black Women Taught Us is me charting my journey to understand myself as a Black feminist and understanding how my life was already kind of on that arc, even though I didn't have the language to necessarily call it that. And that's kind of what the talk today is about in some respects. I'm also very low vision, and I got new eyelashes this week, and I don't wear eyelashes. It was a bad idea. I'm a queer person. I'm an androgynous person, and I look very cute and femme today. This is not my normal getup. This is just for y'all. You're welcome. But these eyelashes are a lot, so I'm going to increase the size of my font so I can actually read it. But what I'm going to talk to you all about today is something I've been thinking about. It doesn't exist anywhere yet. In fact, I'm going to read a part of my book that's coming out in January, and you all will be the first to ever hear it. So, okay. I love y'all's energy. So a couple things about that. I'm talking about this idea of compulsory love today, and I want to start by saying a couple things. I am a scholar who believes that everything that we do and understand about ourselves is inherently political. And so as I move into this conversation, I'm moving away from my colleagues in the political science field and some of those kind of more rigid scholars who are constantly asking, how is this political? My question is usually, how is this not political? And so I'm meditating today with you all, and I say with you all because I actually do want to hear what you all think and how you all feel, because this is my first time talking about this in front of anyone else. I also come to this conversation as a queer, androgynous, polyamorous person. I am gender flux. I don't experience gender very often, and I've never understood monogamy. So I come to this as a person outside of these containers. And I do believe in some ways it allows me to critique them in a particular way, from a particular vantage point. All right? Okay, so let's start with the part that I wrote before I got here, so y'all can deal with the academic part of me. All right, so now I'm going to start making less eye contact, so I apologize in advance. So I really have to look at low vision and eyelashes. Okay? All right. Thank you for understanding. Okay, so one of the first things I learned as a small girl was to comport myself in front of men. There were lessons about what dresses were too short, what shirts or skirts gave off the wrong message, what invitations I might be extending by merely existing in my own skin in public. I would be reminded of these messages throughout adolescence, time and again, by all genders and ages of people. Some of these messages would be warnings to watch out for unwanted attention, but most of these messages would actually be an attempt to shape and mold me into the proper candidate for heterosexual monogamous marriage, the kind that I never intended to enter. These messages about proper gender socialization and romantic expectations became a sort of trauma for queer kids like me, kids who secretly had crushes on their best friends, not the uncomfortably binary conception of the opposite sex, the kind of kids who weren't quite sure what their gender was in the first place, the ones who couldn't conceive of themselves within these containers that didn't seem to fit or feel very good. As an unmistakably black child who was assigned female at birth, the compulsory performances of heteronormative gender only led me to acts of private and public contrition. There was shame, there was persistent guilt, and there was unrelenting fear. I think quite a bit about these experiences when I reflect on the path that so many have taken when entering social and collective movements. We are frequently ignited by a collection of events to which we are related to our community is related to, which encourage us to challenge our existing ways of being and or knowing. Not only that, these events catalyze us, they're disruptive, they're violent encounters often with white supremacy and anti-blackness. They frequently move us toward one another and toward our community. I think often about this, so beautifully depicted in Toni Morrison's Beloved, a book that I revisit every single year. If anyone's not read this, I'll give you a brief synopsis. There's a character in the book, a woman named Setha, and her life is written after Margaret Garner. Margaret Garner was an enslaved black woman who, when escaping slavery, as she was being caught, she ended up actually killing some of her children so that they would not have to re-enter slavery. And in seeing this, white captors, enslavers, thought this woman is out of her mind. But what she said is actually, I'd rather see them go on into glory than to go back into this peculiar institution. And so I think frequently about Toni Morrison's Beloved, because Setha, in the book, is the mother who also killed her child. And she's haunted by this child. The child's name is Beloved. And Setha has a daughter, Denver. And the two of them languish in their home, the sweet home that they call it, at 124 Bluestone Road, for what seems like ages. The ghost of Beloved becomes materialized in a body and haunts them until Setha is almost near death. But what ends up saving them is when Denver goes into her community and asks for support. She lets the women in the community know that they need help. So the women come down the road, and obviously this is a book, so there's no pictures. It's by Toni Morrison. It's not a picture book. But in my mind, right, I imagine these black women, arms wrapped and locked together, singing, right, and coming to save Setha and Denver and to drive the ghosts away. So this talk today is really about the ways that we encounter these systems that are completely out of our control, these white supremacist systems, and we seek ways to survive them, and it's only in community that we begin to heal. So there's questions I'm pondering on, because now you're like, how should you get from polyamory and non-monogamy to Setha and Denver? I'm going to get you there, okay? So during this talk, I want to take some time to think out loud with all of you. I want to sit in this space where Belle, I imagine, sat many times to receive the wisdom that it still holds. I come to this conversation with a litany of questions. Some are, in what ways does a rejection of traditional monogamy and heteronormativity make room for a more expansive, more liberatory politic? How can we challenge compulsory sex and gender roles not only as a means of personal identification and embodiment, but also as a collective rejection of the containers in which we have never fit as a group? And perhaps the central question that has long animated this work: how can loving under a white supremacist framework ever lead to a liberation for Black people? So today I'm going to sit with a few passages from Hooks' book, Sisters of the Yam. I focus on this book because it's the first of Hooks' works to explicitly deal with the reclamation of oneself from trauma and the psychological effects of that self-recovery. In this text, she focuses on self-recovery as a means to not only rid oneself of stress and harm, but as a way to take responsibility for our own saving. You think about Toni Morrison, right? It was Denver going and asking the community for support. That meant that they would come. They knew what was going on in that house, to be clear, because gossip is a thing and we needed to survive, right? But they wasn't coming until Denver went and took the responsibility to ask for that support. So self-recovery in this context is the act of acknowledging the harms of racism, sexism, homophobia, and the like, and acknowledging that we must each reclaim ourselves from these systems that seek to annihilate us. This is not done through personal fiat, but through an embrace of community and a love for oneself that supersedes the systemic violences we encounter. So what is a praxis of self-recovery? Belle offers us a few ways in. So I'm going to give us a few grounding quotes from Sisters of the Yam that have really led me on this conversation. On page 87 of the text, she wrote, "To think of an erotic metaphysics in Black women's lives is to automatically counter the stereotype version of our reality that is daily manufactured and displayed in white supremacist capitalist patriarchal culture." In this passage, Belle suggests that by merely considering the fullness of Black women's lives, and by extension the fullness of all minoritized people's lives, beyond the imagination of their oppressors, is to necessarily combat the caricatures and generalizations of those groups that exist in society. This is critical for a number of reasons, but mainly because it suggests that merely imagining ourselves otherwise and outside of the constraints that are too often keeping us rooted in our trauma and in the harm and in the oppression, this imagination leads us to new ways of being. This resistance and rebellion against a tide of erasure and diminishment allows us to build new selves and new worlds around us. In this framework, our imaginations have the capacity to seed radical change, both within us and within the communities that we curate. On page 97, Belle writes, "Understanding love as a life force that urges us to move against death enables us to see clearly that where love is, there can be no disenabling, disempowering, or life-destroying abuse." This quote animates most of my talk today. Not because it's sweet and talks about love, that's part of it, but because it asks us to move away from thinking about love as some passive act of resolution. It's not about settling in and becoming complacent. Rather, a Hooksian conception of love requires that we see it as an energy. It is something we hold and form actively based on our connections with one another. In this framework, love cannot be white supremacist in origin, nor can it reflect the harm and oppression we experience living under those structures. To move against death, we have to see love as powerful. She also writes on page 102, "As contemporary Black people commit ourselves to collective recovery, we must recognize that attending to our emotional well-being is just as important as taking care of our material needs." I uplift this quote here today because it counters the idea that love is insignificant to our lives and that it's not political. In fact, there's enough data to support the idea that people who find love and authentic relationships live longer, they have healthier lives when they are living longer, and they experience more fullness in their lives. So why is it so hard for Black people to find ourselves in loving conditions that make room for our fullness and our expansiveness? I argue simply that it is because we continue to attempt to love one another using constructs that were never made for us, namely compulsory monogamy and heteronormativity. So how do we recover from compulsory monogamy and heteronormativity? This is the part that people don't like the most, okay? Go with me on this. During the process of enslavement, heteronormative and gendered understandings of the body were also enforced by white captors. Black women's bodies, or at least bodies that were identified as female, were commodified to extend the longevity and the reach of slavery. Essentially, those enslaved people with uteruses were seen as especially valuable for their ability to create more slaves, as laws required that all children born to enslaved people follow the conditions of their mother, not their father. Anybody wonder why? Have an idea why that was the case? Why do we think that enslaved children followed the conditions of their mother and not their father? What? Y'all not saying it loud enough. Why? Right. There you go, right? Because if they had the children follow the conditions of their fathers, we'd have a whole lot more free Black people, right? So the goal there was to actually use law to ensure that rather than have these Black people who were actually the product of rape, right? Because if you know the laws in this moment, Black women could not consent or not consent, right? Enslaved Black women could not, they had no choice. And they couldn't even stand in a court of law and claim that they had been raped, okay? So it's the concept of no bodies to defend, okay? Likewise, for enslaved Black men or Black people who were identified as male at birth, they were assumed to be stronger, bred like cattle, and worked until they often died in the fields. The gendered roles and expectations of the slave plantation and household created a meta-language wherein enslaved Black people were incentivized to align with white-centered behaviors and social mores. These gender understandings were important to their survival. As white slavers were actively upholding Victorian-era expectations of white women's innocence, white men's sexual prowess and power, and the gendered hierarchy of the home, enslaved Black people were expected to learn and internalize these ways of being, and many did so that they could live. In her article, Cheryl I. Harris, is an article called Whiteness is Property. She refers to this process as whiteness transforming into a type of property stake. When whiteness became property, it became wrapped up not only with the public notions of respectability and social order that had stemmed from slavery, it also became the basis of a host of laws which affirmed the status of Black Americans as non-citizens. For example, the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. Do we know what this was about? What's the Fugitive Slave Act about? Anybody? You can throw it out. That's it, right? So this law actually trumped this idea that, I hate saying that word now. Undermined the idea, right, that if a slave escaped the South and made it to the North, that they were free. Instead, no matter where you were, right, if you were in a northern state, you could still be handed over to your slave master. And in fact, there were folks who were frequently punished because they weren't identifiable. There was no way to identify them as a free person. So they were often turned over and enslaved, even when they weren't actually ever owned in this country. Okay? So according to Harris, whiteness was not only used to justify enslavement of Black people and the seizure of land from indigenous Americans, it also was a point of convergence between racial and legal status. This meant whiteness alone was enough to be deemed a normative citizen. All other racial groups were suspect citizens. Thus, these systems and processes were never actually made for us and were in fact meant to keep us in a perpetual state of enslavement. During this era, nuclear households also began to reflect the dominant culture of the English. This conception of the family relied on a closed-ended structure where care, resources, space, and time were only allocated to spouses and children. Extended families are thus outside of the home, and the financial wealth of each family, the unit, is hoarded among those living in the same quarters. Moreover, any excess financial gains are handed down to children, including slaves. This creates a cycle of intergenerational wealth that has intentionally kept financial growth limited to the middle class and the upper class and to white Americans. While enslaved children inherited the conditions of their mothers, white children inherited the conditions of their fathers and their wealth. And that was all built from the same exploitation of thousands of black people. These processes laid the groundwork for the embrace of the nuclear family, and thus compulsory monogamy. This led all the way into the 19th and early 20th centuries, post-slavery. So let's talk about monogamy. Now that we got the history, because I feel like people be like, don't talk about monogamy. Listen, I've got data. Monogamy is a practice of romantic coupling with only one other person at a time. It is often a compulsory expectation that is projected onto children from birth. I'm going to put a little caveat here. It's okay to be monogamous. I'm not saying it's bad if you only want to be with one person. We are talking about compulsory monogamy, the expectation that it's only okay to be monogamous. Okay? It's rooted in the age-old capitalistic structure of family that recreates a nuclear family as a microcosm of a prefab unit of labor production. These units of labor produce and perpetuate notions of belonging and citizenship that are anti-black, queerphobic, transphobic, classist, and ableist. They are rooted in a white capitalist heteropatriarchy. I know y'all understand what that is. And its necessity to categorize, label, delimit, and name. Compulsory monogamy requires that we exclude some black folk, some disabled folk, some minoritized folk from our love. The deviants, the poor, the disabled, the romantically undesirable, the unmarriageable. For black queer people, for black trans people, this is particularly violent. It is framed in such a way to suggest that there are some black people who are worth loving while others are disposable. It tells us that we must always seek out the wealthiest, the strongest, the smartest, read most physically and mentally able person to build our world with, to fashion our families with. Not only that, compulsory monogamy excludes the existence of any alternative styles of love, especially those that would center matriarchs, extended families, and non-traditional world building. Perhaps the most pernicious aspect of compulsory monogamy in its current form in the U.S. is its focus on male needs and patriarchy. Sayings like, who wears the pants in the house? And he's bringing home the bacon, child. Reproduce this idea that monogamy is also wrapped up in labor and gendered household expectations. Not only is the expectation that households will be nuclear and gender binary, these social norms also come preloaded with an array of expectations about how women should behave with men, just like the messages I received as a child. But what if that child is queer? What if they haven't yet come to know what they want in love? What if they are still fashioning a way to properly love themselves? For Black Americans who are descendants of slavery, this is especially violent, and it's a process that harms us because it erases our African homeland traditions. It untethers us from the ancestral practices that were rooted in tribal uplift rather than capitalistic excess and financial gain. Hortense Spillers calls this process American grammar. It is the way our bodies are inscribed upon in a language that is not meant for us. This inscribing process happened to our ancestors when they crossed the Middle Passage during the transatlantic slave trade. According to Spillers, when their bodies were suspended in that liminal space, the space in the in-between time and place, white captors forged a system of control meant to eliminate all connections to our past. By naming, branding, and breaking captured Africans, white slavers and captors were working to create a racialized, gendered, and sexualized system that we are still recovering from today. Kathy Cohen writes in her 1997 article, punks, bull daggers, and welfare queens. While the politics of lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender activists of color might recognize heteronormativity as a primary system of power structuring in our lives, it understands that heteronormativity interacts with institutional racism, patriarchy, and class exploitation to define us in numerous ways as marginal and oppressed subjects. And it is this constructed subservience and this position that allows our sisters and brothers to be used as surplus labor in an advanced capitalist structure and or seen as expendable, denied resources, and thus locked into correctional institutions across the country. Thus, as community members, it is imperative that we see heteronormative expectations in our personal lives as reflective of the larger systemic processes that seek to control and eradicate us. In this article, Cohen pushes us to consider that many Black people, many minoritized people, even those who practice heteronormative ways of being, might actually be queer. This part's not popular either. Go with me on this. The welfare queen, cast as lascivious, outside of the nuclear dynamic, and caricatured as rebuking the tenets of white respectability, is a primary example of the queer heterosexual subject. Y'all with me? Okay, good. And if we think about it, so many more of us might be considered queer. I am queer. So many more of us might be considered queer subjects if we expand our orientation toward community rather than root our solidarities in exclusion and the containers given us by white captors. Okay. You following? You got 2 minutes? All right. So, how can community be a place of self-recovery? What if we accept that Blackness is inherently queer? If queerness is just meant to express existing outside of a normative, then maybe we are all queer. Our bodies have already been coded as such in society that sees Blackness as the initial crime. Thus, as queer subjects, we must see non-monogamy and non-heteronormative love as a liberatory politic. Bell says, love is meant to extend ourselves so that we are mutually responsible for the spiritual growth and development of others. It is akin to work. She says, now I am more confident that community is a healing place. Non-monogamy is the practice of engaging in a romantic relationship with multiple people simultaneously. I'm not encouraging everyone else to go cheat on their partners right now. Don't go cheat. Okay? We're talking about ethical non-monogamy, right? It's an umbrella term where we engage in community and care and communication with people who understand that we love expansively. I'm going to rush this last part because I want y'all to get this last piece that I wrote in my book. Okay? This is from the book. Okay? Many Black women don't love themselves justly. We don't love ourselves toward freedom and out of domination we've endured over the course of our lives. We don't love ourselves beyond harms we encounter. Why? Because loving Black women is incredibly lonely. Instead, I'd argue that we love ourselves by heading to an early grave. We love ourselves by spreading ourselves so thin that we serve everyone's needs but our own. We love ourselves into the lives and livelihoods of everyone around us because we frequently think that it's the only way we will receive love in return. Our love becomes the lifeblood we use to raise children, build churches, start social movements, and rescue Black folk from police violence and all manner of systemic discrimination. If this book has shown nothing else, it shows that Black women's love for Black people knows no bounds. And maybe that's part of the problem. Black women's love is so used up, so extracted, is so relied upon by everyone except us, that there's rarely any left for us to keep ourselves alive. I have grown to believe, especially after writing my book, and reflecting on the countless Black women whose lives have ended abruptly and painfully due to exhaustion, overwork, and physical exploitation, that loving Black women requires beautiful things. It requires softness, gentle words and touches, peaceful moments, loving glances, and the quietness of persistent joy. Loving Black women and loving ourselves justly requires that we stop giving ourselves away to prove our worth and value. Loving us requires that we stop substituting presence for care and niceness for nurturing. It necessitates patience, grace, second and third chances, and the boundaries that move us toward harmony and peace with our lives. We have to build communities and comradeship that don't require that our cups be empty before they seek to fill us back up. Time. Should I stay here? Or should I stay there? You want to come here?
Oh, do I have to stand up? Oh, Lord Jesus. Oh, gosh. Yeah, I was not. Can I sit here? Is that a thing? Yeah, let's sit here. So first of all, I just want to say you read me in a really great way. I love being read. I don't like being right. But I will read notes. In full disclosure, my mind and nervous system is absolutely shot. There was an intruder in my home, and thank God Shadi was there with me. The police apprehended her in my clothes, and all these other things. So I am not well, but I always show up for you all, and just so grateful that you were here. So I'm coming as raw as I can be, and this is not perfect, but I am not perfect.
Nothing has to be perfect. You're good.
This isn't profound. It's just some things I was jotting down, and I was jotting down more as you were talking. I will stop apologizing because Dr. Jackson says stop apologizing. Okay, I will start by saying I feel read in a good way. Listening to Dr. Jackson, I long for the freedom of non-monogamy. Yes. Honestly, I tried it this summer and it was too much. I was just bad at it. I couldn't remember what I said to who, was mixing people up. And I had just found out what ethically non-monogamous meant because it was E&M on Bumble and Hinge. And I thought it was like a disc profile or like, y'all laugh at me because I really thought, I was like, oh, that's nice that they put their like Enneagram on there or something or whatever. So serious, right? So with that being said, some of them I judged because I thought some of them were eliding the ethically part, right? So I think that when we have these conversations, not everybody's talking about E&M like Dr. Jackson is talking about E&M, you know? So I have the queerness down, the non-binariness down, but I feel Dr. Jackson pointed to a gap in my love politic. My hobby and habit is thinking of metaphysics, Afrofuturism. I turned the Christianity class into approaches. My students are here. Shout out to my students. They told me to teach about Christianity, the understandings of Christianity. I said, yes, through an Afrofuturistic lens and Black feminism. You know, shout out to Shadi for helping me with that too. But in erotic metaphysics, yikes. My erotic is very much rooted in my trauma, even as I welcome love as a will and intentions for one's own spiritual growth and others, as Bell tells us to. So to my students in the class, to the room, I was really excited by Dr. Jackson's question. Actually, I am obsessed with this question. How can loving under a white supremacist framework ever lead to liberation for Black people? And I want us to think about that. So I'm going to say it again. If y'all have a notebook or if you have a phone, we'll be discussing this. How can loving under a white supremacist framework ever lead to liberation for Black people? So we're going to go over that. But overall, I found their talk thought-provoking, and it definitely moved some pieces in my soul as a disabled, Christian-adjacent Black woman on the autism, ADHD, asexual, queer spectrum that still very much, maybe insanely, desires monogamy. That likely stems from my spiritual beliefs. And I know that a lot of us have spiritual beliefs in this room, and I am critically moving through their points on monogamy as labor production, while myself dreaming of love that Bell speaks of that exists for spiritual growth. Spiritual growth can be as a labor of love, but I am pondering if there is room for monogamous or even platonic love as a liberatory politic as well, which you did say we're not talking about. So I got it. Okay, the quote below really made me think of my own desire for marriage and kids. I'm obsessed. I have a 13-year-old, but I think over and over again, I'm almost 40, I need more kids, I ain't never been married. And I know that comes from religion, right? I was going to be a youth pastor, y'all. That's a lot. So as this is what I wanted to point out, as queer subjects, we must see non-monogamy as a liberatory politic. Monogamy is the practice of romantic coupling with only one person at a time. It is often a compulsory expectation that is projected onto children from birth. And it is rooted in the age-old capitalistic structures of family that recreate the nuclear family as a microcosm of prefab units of labor production. These units of labor perpetuate notions of belonging and citizenship that are anti-black, queerphobic, transphobic, classist, and ableist. They are rooted in white capitalist heteropatriarchy and its necessity to categorize, label, delimit, and name. That read me. I'm like, what? Okay, so what am I doing? I think everything I do is about liberation. Literally everything. And here I am still trying to be monogamous, having this marriage and this kids and this nuclear family, and it eats away at me. So are you saving me? I mean, I can save myself, but so I'm teetering. Must we all let monogamy go? And we don't, because you said that. Especially for the religious black folks, that might be difficult, myself included. I am grateful to be read, though. It is rearranging some of the pressure I have on myself for marriage and the nuclear family by thinking of it as rooted in labor production and white capitalist heteropatriarchy. I can't do it. So that's all I got. Like, that's all I got for you. Thank you.